Hi, this is Russ Anderson. SynthEyes has excellent built-in stabilization, leveraging its tracking capabilities. It's an advantage that you can generate the stabilized images in SynthEyes, but it's sometimes a disadvantage that you have to generate the stabilized images inside of SynthEyes. If you're doing compositing in a downstream application, you might like to save some steps and do the stabilization as part of the compositing. That's been possible previously by exporting image distortion maps, but that isn't very efficient. Because SynthEyes stabilization does physically correct manipulation of the image, we can create a quote-unquote physical equivalent that can be exported to the 3D environment of the downstream app, which allows it to recreate the stabilization. You can do that in SynthEyes with the Stabilization Rig Creator script, which we'll show in this tutorial. I'll show some of the cool things it can handle, starting first with a basic stabilization-only workflow, then moving on to stabilization based on a full 3D solve, and finally look at how zooms and animated distortions are handled. There's also a section on removing the stabilization rig. So let's get started. Here's our shot from a helicopter, and we just need to stabilize it here. We're going to start off by running the auto tracker, and for this initial kind of stabilization, we don't need to get a 3D solve, so we're not going to start the solver at all. We've just got the trackers. We're going to use them in the 2D sense to do the stabilization. So we're going to open up the image preprocessor, and typically you do that just by hitting the P key. That brings it up. And although we're not going to do a 3D solve, we do need to have an estimate for the field of view of the camera. And typically you're going to get that from some other shot that you do have a valid 3D solve for, or perhaps from the focal length and sensor sizes if you do happen to have that information. So in this case it's about 50 degrees, so we're just going to plug that in. Now we'll go over and set up the stabilization itself. We'll just click in the middle here to make sure none of the trackers are selected, and we'll do a get tracks, so that will get all of them. And we're going to go to filter mode for both the position, direction of the shot and the rotation as well. So we've got our initial stabilization set up here inside of the image preprocessor, and as you can see there's still some areas that aren't covered here, especially at the beginning. So we're going to hit auto scale, which is just going to pop in and it's going to blow up the image a little to cover the uncovered dark areas throughout the shot. So now if we scrub through, we can see the whole thing. And now we'll just drop out of the image preprocessor, and SynthEyes will start calculating the stabilized images throughout the entire shot. So that's what you're looking at here. And you'll notice that the trackers are still jumping around and they no longer line up with the imagery at all. We could have fixed that inside of the image preprocessor, but there's no need to do that because what we're about to do, which is to go over into the projection screen menu and start up the Stabilization Rig Creator. Now there are a bunch of different options here, and we're just going to run through these. So we're going to say that the camera is already stable because it's not moving. It's a stationary camera because we haven't done a 3D solve. We do want to update the 2D tracking so that everything matches up here because we didn't do that inside the image preprocessor. And we are going to generate a simple plane, which is good for exporting to After Effects or any other application that really doesn't handle arbitrary 3D meshes, but can handle any 2D distortion that comes its way. So After Effects is the principal suspect for that. And we'll just leave the other settings alone. We'll hit OK. Get a little pop-up that points out that the solver and the image preprocessor have different ideas what the field of view is. In this case, we set up the one in the image preprocessor, so we don't want to copy. So just click No. And now we get this very large white screen. And you wonder what happened. You need to go into the perspective view now to be able to see what's actually going on. And in fact, we need to go and, to be sure, we'll turn off the normal background display of the perspective view, and we'll lock to it. And now we're seeing the stabilized image inside the perspective view, as well as the 2D tracker locations, which are just these little crosshairs. Those are all locked up to the right places. To understand what's happening, let's go out to the quad view. Actually, we'll go to quad perspective. And you'll see that we've got the camera, we've got a projection screen, and it actually has the shot as its background texture. And as you scrub through the shot, that projection screen is being moved around in order to present the stabilized version of the shot to the camera. And the camera is just sitting stationary, as we said. So that's the physical gag that we're setting up. We're essentially flying this projection screen along in front of the camera and making it go back and forth to counteract the motion of the camera during the original shoot. The result is the camera sees only a stable image. So this physical setup here can now be exported to your downstream animation or compositing package. For this particular section, we're going to go to After Effects. And we'll just go with the default settings. I've got After Effects already started in the background, just doing nothing. And SynthEyes just exported the script. It's an annoying little screen. And it exported that script out, and After Effects just ran it. So that was the process that you just saw. And as you see, that happened very, very quickly. And now we have the stabilized version of the shot available inside of After Effects. And you'll see as I scrub through it, you'll see the projection screen moving around. And again, as it did in SynthEyes, the result that the camera sees is the stabilized shot that we're looking for. But rather than being a 2D sort of effect, this is a 3D environment that's been set up to do it. And we can go out here into AE's 3D environment and see that from the different views inside AE, that really this is a full 3D effect that we're doing. Now, depending on what application you're exporting to, you might have to do a little additional work inside of that application. Here, really what we should be doing is we should turn off the background image that's being generated from here at the very bottom of this stack inside of After Effects, that bottom layer, which is the normal thing that you see inside of an After Effects export from SynthEyes. So that we don't need in this setup because it's being done in this 3D method instead. But in other applications, you might need to actually do the setup of the shot texture onto the screen, depending on the capabilities of that particular export. So this is a basic 2D sort of, 2.5D sort of stabilization. There's no 3D solve. So this is our first case. Okay, now we're going to move to a full 3D solve. Here's our shot. It's from a drone. It has a bit of bounce to it that we'd like to remove. It also has a bunch of lens distortion that we're going to handle. Again, we'll start out with the auto tracker, and we'll need to do a little cleanup to it. Here we'll just do the barest minimum. We'll take out this tracker in the sky. Normally you should do a bit more cleanup, and you might even have to do some supervised trackers depending on whatever your shot might happen to be. But you need to get it ready for the 3D solve. So let's go over and do that. We're going to turn on the calculate distortion and then fire up the solver. We got really a pretty good solve right off the bat, but just for fun, let's go and turn on the additional distortion terms. We'll refine the solve. So we drop from 4296 down to 4174. So it's a little bit of an improvement. We'll take it. It's certainly not a hugely significant improvement though. Because we did this lens distortion, we do a lens distortion in the shot. At this point, we need to run the lens distortion workflow script. We're going to run it in the redistorted mode, which generates images that look like this, where the entire source image has been preserved and the image has been padded up a little bit to preserve the accuracy and resolution of the whole process. And we want to preserve as much of the image quality as possible going into the stabilization step. So let's go to do that. We're going to hit P again to bring up the image stabilization. And here you'll notice that the lens field of view has already been set up. That's done by the lens workflow script. So you don't want to mess with that. We'll go over to the stabilization, and we're just clicking into the background to make sure that you don't have any trackers selected. We'll hit Get Tracks, and we'll set up a basic filter-based stabilization. I invite you to look in the manual to learn about how you can take advantage of these controls to do different things, like being able to nicely stabilize particular parts of your scene. And of course, you can also art direct the stabilizer a bit with the adjust controls here. But we have the basic stabilization set up, and we'll just hit auto scale to zoom in and eliminate the little backgrounds. And now we've got our stabilized images. You'll see it's recomputing for the RAM cache, but we're not really interested in that at all. We would be if we were going to output that from SynthEyes, but the whole point of this exercise is not to do that. One thing just to point out again, even though the final result of this process here looks like a lens workflow number 1, we're actually using the number 2 mode initially before stabilization to preserve as much of the image as possible. Now we're ready to go and run the Stabilization Rig Creator, and the options are going to be a bit different than before. These are just the default settings. We keep this camera already stable option off. We just did the solve, so the camera is actually following the path of the drone, bouncing all around. And we're going to keep this off, so the script is going to update that camera path. It's also going to update the 2D tracking, so we didn't do that in the image preprocessor. There wasn't any need because we're going to just check that box. And we're going to keep the simple plane option off because here we're going to export to Fusion, which is a full 3D mesh capable application. And we're going to feed it a 3D mesh. And let's do that, and we'll see what that mesh is going to be. You can see it up here in the front view. Instead of having a pure projection screen, a nice rectangular projection screen, now the projection screen has this shape here that compensates for the distortion in the shot. And not only is it there, But if I scrub through the shot and you look up in the top view, the top left, you'll see that it flies along with the camera. And there's actually a moving object that's on the same trajectory as the camera. The camera is now following a nice smoothed out path. It's not smooth in trajectory, but it's smooth in the direction that it's looking. And the moving object that's there at the same time, I can't easily show it, but we'll jump over to the perspective view and geometric hierarchy view. But the that moving object is the parent of the projection screen, and it's this holder, the camera screen holder object that has the animation on it to move the screen around in the direction that we need. So again, to see the stabilized version properly, we need to turn off the show image so that we're just seeing the textured plane. So we're just seeing the textured plane and textured and distorted plane that was generated by the Stabilization Rig Creator. You'll notice that the trackers now line up with the positions in the image that they were originally intended to be. And this is all in 3D, and that's telling you the camera path is now smoother and everything is locked up consistently for export to our downstream 3D application. So let's go and do that now. As advertised, we're going to export to Fusion. We're just going to use the default settings. One thing I'll point out is that we're not going to have Fusion start up and open that exported file immediately. It takes Fusion a little while to open up and to reposition it into the screen capture window so you can see it. So I'm just going to export and just manually go over in Fusion and open up that comp that SynthEyes just wrote out. So that gives us this setup, and we can look at the final result, and we can look at the full 3D environment that's present as well. Just scrolling out in Fusion in these views so you can see the whole thing. And again, you get the camera is moving along its animated path along with that holder object, and the screen is out there too, moving along and being animated so that only the right stable part of the image is sitting in front of the camera at any particular point in time. So just so that we can see this a little better, we're going to put the actual source image there on the left now. Well, we've still got it stuck in. Okay. I don't know where that quad setting went. So we've got the source image on the left, we've got the result on the right, and now we can have Fusion just run through. And there's one other thing that we need to do, and you'll see this is some craziness here. And I'll point out that the exports that you get out of SynthEyes might need to be modified a little in the downstream application. And here we've got a conflict between the projection screen that SynthEyes has and one that Fusion is generating, because the source images are being presented to its camera input. So I just disconnect that input. That input is set up automatically by the normal SynthEyes export where you want it. In this particular case, you don't want it, so we'll just take that off. I'll point out, depending on what applications you're going to, you might need to do something like that. In After Effects, we just hid that bottom layer. In other applications, you might need to set up the texturing on the screen mesh to be the actual source shot if that's something that isn't set up automatically by the SynthEyes exporter. So you just need to pay a little attention once you've done the export, depending on what you have to make sure that it is following the right basic idea and not doing anything extraneous in the process. So now, we'll continue our playback here, and you'll see the stabilized version of the shot on the right, the source shot on the left. And there's nothing super dramatic to this process, just because the original shot wasn't horrible. You see that there's some flickering in the display there, just because the view there was zoomed in. So it doesn't play back terribly fast, but you can see that this guy is bouncing around on the left, and we've got the nice stable version on the right. And it's all being generated by this 3D setup here. You can actually turn out, take away the light there and simplify it a little bit, perhaps, when the point cloud here if you don't need it. But with this setup, you do have the ability now to go and add your 3D effects into the shot, do whatever other compositing you need to have in the Fusion environment. Sometimes you're going to want to remove the rig and stabilization and work on the tracking some more. The simplest approach to do that is just to do undo, and I can right click on the undo there and look at the history and go back to any point that I want. But if you close the file and then reopened it, or done some other things you don't want to undo, there is also a script to be able to remove the rig and the things that it does directly. To do that, we'll just go down to the projection screen area again and hit the stabilization removal, and it goes and undoes everything. And you'll see that we need to turn show image back on. And now we're looking at what's coming out of the image preprocessor. Because the rig is all gone, the camera is back on its bouncy path. And if you need to go further back, now you want to go and run the lens workflow script again and select the undo earlier run option. And that gets you all the way back to the original image, and we've got the trackers back in their original spots. It's just like none of this ever happened again. So that's how you can get back to where you need to go, undoing each of those steps as needed by actually running a computational script to figure it out. Now let's see what happens with a more complex shot. This is a kind of terrible shot with a zoom that's taken from a GH4 with a speed booster and a Canon L series lens. Because there's a manual zoom ring, it's very jerky, you see, not only in the images themselves, but also in the way that the zoom is moving. And this particular lens has a bunch of distortion at the wide end. So we're going to go and see what we can do to improve this shot. As usual, we're going to start out with the auto tracker, and there's the usual caveat that you should probably take a look at these trackers and make sure they're really okay. We're just going to move on to the solver. And because it is a zoom shot, we do need to let it know. And we're just going to turn on a couple of the distortion settings here and fire up the solver. So we get an initial solve that's a little bit under 9/10 of a pixel. So that's really pretty good. Now, because this is a zooming shot with distortion, we're going to take advantage of the zooming distortion feature in SynthEyes and the solver that will be giving us more distortion at the wide end of the shot and not so much inside. So now we'll run the solver again just to show what happens. And you see now it's down to 0.85. So, it's improved it by 0.05. Not a huge change by any stretch of the imagination, but it's something, and in this case it gives us what we need for this particular demo. Because we do have lens distortion involved, we need to run the lens workflow. We have the choice of using one or two, and I have, I've previously been telling you to use two. I believe that's the right idea, and it is possible to use one, I'll point out, and there's a reason that can make things a little simpler, and I'll show that in a minute. So we run the lens distortion workflow. You can see the little padding around the outside there. And it's going and computing the images, but we don't really need them. So we're going to just hit P and bring up the image preprocessor. And I am going to set up the standard stabilization that I've been doing all along. We'll hit Get Tracks, filter, and 1. Just a 1 hertz value, and run the auto scale. So that gives us our stabilized version of the shot. Here's the step I keep forgetting. You need to turn on the output resampling so that the shot gets to the original resolution. It's an HD shot, so these default to the HD resolution and aspect. So I don't need to do anything here. If you have different image size, you can set these up appropriately. But this is just necessary to make sure that you get the same stabilized resolution going out that you do coming in. And it doesn't cause any additional resampling. This just controls what resampling is done in the first place. And again, it's computing that. Wait a little, you can see that that's a much more stable version. We get a chance to look at it a little longer. We don't really need to wait for it to compute it at all. So for starters, we're going to export to After Effects now to show what happens. And we'll fire up the Stabilization Rig Creator. And this time we're going to keep the simple plane option on because we're going to After Effects. Now let's take a look at what that gives us. If you go to the quad perspective view, say, we've got our plane out there. And as the zoom changes, it needs to move the plane further away in order to keep the right field of view. It's not, it doesn't dynamically scale the mesh. Instead, it's actually moving it, and you can see that the object that's the holder of the screen is moving out away from the camera in order to do that. So it's an interesting little setup, and this again it gives us something that the exporters can handle. Now, in the perspective view, if we go and lock and turn off the image there, you'll see that there's something funky that happens, and this is a far clipping distance effect. As the plane moves out, it's kind of unexpectedly large. So we can just right click in the perspective view and hit the perspective view settings. And we'll just set that far clipping plane value up to 2000, say. It's also possible to change the world size, but that winds up being a little bit different than what's going on here. So just changing the far clipping plane is the right way to go, and I know people aren't always aware of where that control is. We have our setup for After Effects. Let's let that export go. We've got this already set up. After Effects has started. It's just going to run the export. Here comes After Effects running that export. And now we've got the version of the shot here. So we're doing this stabilization all just within After Effects. And you can look at the 3D environment where it's got the same setup as before with that plane that's moving around. In order to do all this, it doesn't actually show anything happening unless you click, but here's the stabilized version of the shot inside of After Effects. So you can go now and add your 3D effects to it if you like within this particular setup. Just for the sake of it, we'll point out also you do want to turn off the visibility of that other layer just in case it gets in the way somehow. And if you want to do just straight 2D effects in After Effects, you can just take the output of this comp and use that in your other 2D comp instead. So that'll flatten it out and give you just this sequence of images to work with instead. One thing to point out about this setup is that we do have the source images are sitting down here and they're attached to the screen holder. They do have an effect on them. And just to point out what's going on, now you do have animated values up here for the distortion coefficients. So that's how the distortion is being handled in the After Effects environment. SynthEyes has exported the per frame sets of distortion coefficients to use, and those are just animating up the controls on the distortion effect there. Now we're going to go and export to a 3D application, in this case Blender. I'm just going to go and remove, undo the existing stabilization rig setup. I could do the stabilization rig removal script instead if the undo is no longer available. Having removed it, we're going to go run it again, and this time we're going to keep the simple plane setting off. And what's going on now is that it's generating a Vertex Cache file that handles the animation of the changing shape of the projection screen as the distortion changes. Now in 1809, the Vertex Cache file can't be set up automatically, so we need to do that directly. So it's telling you what to do here. Just going to go over to the 3D view, open up the Vertex Cache button and select that. Select no. Now we can go over to the geometric hierarchy and the perspective view, and just make sure we've got show image off, and here's the stabilized version again. And let's go look at what's happening now. Keep the quad perspective maybe. So as we scrub through the shot, you'll see that now the projection screen here is actually changing size as we move through the shot to compensate for the zoom. And also, if we look in the front view, you'll see that it goes to have a kind of more bent shape at some points, and then it straightens out. So the shape of it is changing over time as well. It's not a terribly obvious feature at this resolution, but that's what's going on. It's actually animating the shape of the mesh over time, and that's set up in a Vertex Cache file, so we can go and export now to our 3D application using that. So we'll go and start up our Blender export. So Blender's started up here. Let me just reposition it a little better. And we have one little adjustment to make again to get the projection screen set up right. So we'll just go dig into the hierarchy here a little. This is the projection screen that's the normal default unmodified one that's produced by the Blender exporter. That's something that we don't want. And the one down here, is the one that we do want. The thing that we do want to get from the default one is actually the material. So we can just drag the material into the viewport onto that projection screen. And Blender needs a little to get going. Once we start scrubbing, that gets into position right. And now we can scrub through the shot and see that we've got the stabilized version of the shot being generated here in Blender as well. And that's using this Vertex Cache effect to be able to compensate for the zoom, for the animated distortion as well. So some pretty interesting things can happen coming out of the Stabilization Rig Creation script, depending on what exactly it sees the situation to be. So thanks for watching all this. Hope this helps you out a lot.